When we're together as a Sangha, even online, it all feels quite sort of light and friendly. But in some ways, this feels like quite a dark time. It's the dark of the year. It feels like a dark time for our country, to me anyway. And it's a dark time for many people as individuals. And I'm going to tell a story that starts at a dark time of the year, and a very, very dark time for the main character. But it's a story that leads from darkness to light. And it tells us a lot about how we can move from darkness to light, out of dark times as individuals, and I think as a society as well. And this is a true story. It's a true story. Well, it's a true story in the sense that it's true to reality. It's true to how things work. It's true to how, particularly to how a human being grows. And because of that, it illustrates several important Dharmic teachings. Now, if you've been around for a while, you'll probably have guessed that the story I'm going to tell is the story of Scrooge, from Dickens' The Christmas Carol. Every year, the centre team get my arm up behind my back and force me to give a talk on Scrooge. So I've done it every year for so long, I've forgotten when it started. And every year, I accept the challenge of finding a way to help it illustrate, to use it to illustrate a different Dharmic teaching. So we've had Scrooge and the wisdom of the depths. We've had Scrooge and the four reminders, the four reflections that turn the mind to the Dharma. We even had Tantric Scrooge and many others. But this year, I can't do it. I can't find another one. I'm going to relate the story to a theme that I did quite a few years ago, but it's particularly relevant because it is related to the theme we're going to follow in the new year. So this year, I'm going to use the story of Scrooge to illustrate Sangharakshita's 5 aspects of the spiritual path. 5 aspects of the way we grow from darkness towards light. And then in our next series of Sangha Nights, we're going to be telling more stories to expand our understanding of these 5 aspects. So this talk can set the scene for that. So because I'm referring to the 5 aspects of the spiritual path, and you may not have come across them, I'll also list them before we start. So I don't know, can you put a screen up for me? If I get a screen, is that possible? Whoever's in charge.
You mean you would like to put your screen up?
Yes, could you do that?
Yeah, I can make it possible for you to do it.
Oh, well, I don't know how. Look, anyway, I'll tell you what they are, and maybe we'll see what happens. So the 5 aspects of the spiritual life are integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and receptivity. And I have no idea how to make my screen. Anyway, we'll see. Maybe you can remember them. Integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and receptivity. And the first 4 of those form a sort of sequence. I think Surimati's just come in to help me. Yeah, there.
Okay. So you ask?
No, I'm good. Forget it.
Okay.
Forget that. I've told you what they are. Remember them. Integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and receptivity. And the first 4 form a sort of sequence in that integration and positive emotion need to come before spiritual death and spiritual rebirth. While the last one, receptivity, is a quality that needs to run through all the other aspects. So if you don't understand what any of those mean, don't worry too much about it, because I hope they'll become clear as we go along, and I think we might be getting them on the chat anyway, these aspects. But for now, let's get on with our story. So the story starts by introducing us to one Ebenezer Scrooge, a character who's become so famous or infamous that he's entered our language. So Dickens spends, ooh, well, there you go. So there you go. You might want to jot those down if you haven't come across them. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, so he's so infamous that he's entered our language. And Dickens spends quite a lot of time describing him. So the main metaphor he uses to describe Scrooge is cold. He's cold and hard. He's frozen. So Dickens says, the cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, made his thin lips blue. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the summer, and he did not thaw it 1 degree in the winter at Christmas. So Scrooge is a frozen man. He has frozen all warm emotions. He's become frozen into a cramped, stiff, distorted version of a human being, of himself. And this has completely cut him off from other people, from any fellow feeling, any sense of solidarity with others, from any generosity, from any altruism, and from any meaning higher, any higher meaning, except, of course, money. And of course, that's what Scrooge is famous for. He's a stingy miser. Scrooge is a stingy miser. But that is just a symptom. That's just a symptom of his frozen state. Yeah, it's just a symptom, really, this sort of miserliness. We all have to go for refuge to something, using Buddhist terminology. We all have to find meaning in something. And Scrooge is cut off from any better meaning. So he goes for refuge to money, to profit, to business, to the accumulation of capital. And of course, that means that Scrooge is a desperately unhappy man. He's a very, very unhappy man. Although he doesn't admit it, of course. He can't admit it to himself. So when his nephew wishes him a Merry Christmas, he famously replies, "Bah, humbug." And then he goes, "Merry Christmas? What reason do you have to be merry? You are poor enough." That's what he says to his nephew. But his nephew replies, "What reason have you got to be dismal then? You're rich enough." And Scrooge seems to me to be very much in keeping with the spirit of our times. I'll say more about that later. He seems to think that, if you like, economic growth, having more and more money and more stuff is the key to human happiness and well-being. But we don't seem to have noticed that we are already rich enough, as his nephew says to Scrooge. Yet so many people live unfulfilled lives like Scrooge. So Scrooge is in a dark place. And of course, our story starts by showing him at a dark time, the dark of the year, Christmas Eve. So he's in his office, his cold office, where he's just got a tiny little fire in his room and one single coal in the room that his clerk works in. He's thoroughly nasty to his nephew. He refuses his nephew's invitation to Christmas dinner. He's thoroughly nasty to his poor, underpaid and overworked clerk, Bob Cratchit. And he's thoroughly nasty to the charity collectors who come around collecting money for the poor. So he closes his cold, underheated office as this frosty night falls over foggy London. This is the creepy, foggy Victorian London that we've seen in so many films. Where people are just vague shapes in the gloom, and the church clocks strike, but you can't see any of them. Everything's just dark, dark, dark. And Scrooge goes for his lonely dinner in his usual gloomy, dismal inn. And while he's there, the night just thickens and thickens and thickens. So that when he comes out, he can hardly see where he's going through the murk. But he sort of makes his way home. And when he gets near his home, he sort of has to make his way through the gloomy courtyard that his rooms are at the back of by touch. He has to make his way by touch. And then in that gloom, he reaches for his door. But instead of his usual door knocker, he sees the head of his old business partner, Jacob Marley, who's been dead these past 6 years. So he recalls in horror. He recalls in horror. This is the beginning. This is the beginning of something trying to break into Scrooge's frozen state, a bit like a plant growing through the winter ice and snow. Something is trying to break into his prison. Some sort of light is trying to break into his his cramped state. Something, maybe something in Scrooge, something deep in Scrooge, maybe something in the universe, whatever it is that gives us that urge to grow and develop. It started by Scrooge seeing Jacob Marley's head on his door. But he recovers himself. He thinks, well, says what of course he says, bah humbug, bah humbug. He turns the many locks on his door with his many heavy keys and pushes it open. But then when he gets into the hallway of his big, empty, dark house, he thinks he sees a hearse with a coffin on it going up the great big broad stairs. And then when he gets into his big, dark, gloomy, empty living room, his fireplace is carved with all sorts of figures, and on those figures, each of those figures, he sees the head again of his old dead business partner, Jacob Marley. And a bell starts to toll. And he hears the clanking of chains as though someone is dragging them across the floor. And then Jacob Marley's ghost appears to him, looking very miserable and all wrapped about with chains. And Jacob Marley's ghost gives Scrooge a terrible warning. He tells him that the reason he is wrapped in these chains is because of his self-centered life, in which he didn't care about anyone but himself and his money. And because of that, he's doomed to wander in chains. He says, I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Would you like to know, he says, the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was just as heavy as this one those 7 Christmas Eves ago, but you've been working on it ever since. It is a terrible, ponderous, heavy chain. So Jacob Marley's ghost, or whatever this represents in the depths of Scrooge or in the heights of the universe, whatever that represents, it confronts Scrooge. It confronts Scrooge with the reality of impermanence and death, which he would rather forget. And it confronts him with the reality of the law of karma. By our actions, by the way we live, we create the person we become. And by the way he is living, Scrooge is, in a metaphorical way, making a terrible chain for himself that he will have to drag around even after death. So Jacob Marley's ghost gives him this terrible warning and tells him that he must change. And he says he will see 3 more spirits during the course of this night that will bring that change about. But of course, Scrooge is not receptive to this message. He does not want to hear this message. He doesn't want to change. He doesn't want to hear he has to change, and he doesn't want to change. He puts up his defenses. He puts up his defenses. So while all this is happening, he protects himself with his usual old defense of sort of cynical skepticism. He even tries to make a joke of it. So he says that a vision like this is nothing more than the result of a bad dinner, and that Jacob Marley's ghost smells more of gravy than of the grave. It's not a very funny joke, but obviously amused Scrooge. When we don't want to change, when we don't want the way we are living to be challenged or threatened, even if that way of living makes us unhappy, we lack, of course, the 5th of our 5 aspects of the spiritual life. We lack receptivity, and we're probably not going anywhere in the spiritual life. We stay stuck. And when we don't want to be receptive, we put up all sorts of defenses, like Scrooge is doing. But if we're lucky, usually whatever it is that's pushing us to grow manages to break through those defenses. But if we're resisting, the way it does that may not be very pleasant, and it's not all that pleasant for Scrooge. Sometimes we need to be violently kicked out of our old patterns, our old ruts. And so it is with Scrooge. So it is with Scrooge. The ghost promised him 3 spirits would appear during the course of the night, and so it happens. So Scrooge, various things happen, but Scrooge anxiously tries to sleep in his dark, gloomy house with the clock ticking and chiming the quarter hours. And then at 1 a.m, something fills his room with light. His room is filled with light, and something strips the curtains away from around his bed. And this very, very strange being appears, partly like a child, partly like a very old man. It's really interesting in the story. I can't describe it all. And this spirit says to Scrooge, "I am the ghost of Christmas past. Your past." And the ghost wants to take Scrooge and show him some things from his past, from Scrooge's past. But Scrooge doesn't want to know. He doesn't want to know. He resists. Again, he's anything but receptive. And light shines from the ghost, and Scrooge tries to snuff it out, asks him to snuff it out. Of course, this is the light of awareness, but Scrooge does not want to be made aware. But in the end, the ghost takes him on a journey against his will, and it carries him out over the night, over London, over the surrounding countryside, until he gets to a landscape he remembers from his childhood. And there he is shown himself. He's shown himself as a miserable young boy, poor and lonely and neglected, sitting reading by himself in a corner. Scrooge obviously had a terrible, sad, friendless, neglected, lonely childhood. And at some level, he is still that child. He's still that child. He's a sad and lonely person. But the last thing he wants is to be made aware of this. Sadness and loneliness are not emotions that he will allow himself to feel. This would destroy his image of himself as this successful businessman, better than everybody else. So until now, he's thrust these emotions down. He's refused to own up to them and refused to be aware of them. And the ghost had to drag him unwillingly to see his own sadness. So this awareness brought by the ghost of Christmas past is the awareness that allows us to become integrated, the first of the 5 aspects of the spiritual life. Integrated, we could just say whole. To be integrated is to be whole. If bits of us are cut off because we don't want to know them, we don't want to own them, they're not integrated, and we are not whole. we're not a whole harmonious person. We're not an individual. We're not able to make our own decisions because these bits that we cut off and don't want to know about, they don't go away. They rule us from the shadows of our unawareness a lot of the time. So we can see Scrooge's whole way of life as a way of compensating for his sadness and his loneliness. He doesn't feel accepted by people, so he tries to look down on ordinary people by having more money than they do and shore himself up and protect himself by having money and possessions. The things he won't own up to, in himself are ruling him from the shadows. And to begin to undo that, he has to go back to the past. The ghost takes him back to the past. As part of our process of integration, we usually, often, certainly need to go back and become aware of our past, become aware of the conditions, the things that have made us who we are, so that we can begin to integrate them to be free from them. So the ghost dragged him to an awareness of his childhood, an awareness of the hidden sadness and loneliness and sense of alienation from others that was still driving him. And having become aware of it, he could integrate this part of himself. He could make friends with the lonely child he had been. He could become more of an integrated individual. And when he does this, because of the ghosts forcing him to see, this releases a flood of positive emotion, the second aspect of the spiritual path, according to Sangharakshita. When we refuse to be aware of our painful emotions, like sadness, this tends to freeze our whole emotional life. We don't really feel any emotion if we won't allow ourselves to feel our emotions. And this is why Scrooge has become a frozen man. He's frozen into this cramped, distorted person to keep his sadness away. To keep his sadness away, he's frozen all emotion, and no positive emotion could get a look in. But beginning to integrate his past has begun to unfreeze him. He feels compassion. He feels compassion for the suffering of his younger self. And this immediately turns into compassion for other children, like the child he was. So he gets an uprush of regret for having turned away a child just like himself who came to his door begging for food. And the ghost of Christmas past also shows him his sister who died as a young adult, and he re-experiences all the grief and sadness at her death. And this releases all his fond feelings for her, the love that he had frozen out completely. And then he's shown himself in his first job with his close friend Dick. He actually had a friend. He had a close friend Dick and a very kind employer who goes by the grand Dickensian name of Mr. Fezziwig. And he remembers the kindness of his employer, and he feels this strong uprush of gratitude. So for Scrooge, an awareness of the suffering he experienced as a child, which he's been pushing down out of his awareness, he lets that come into the light of his consciousness. And when he does this, it opens the door to empathy for others, compassion for the suffering of others, gratitude. When he opens the door to one emotion, others come into, he experiences metta, gratitude. He becomes more integrated, and positive emotion, the second of our aspects, bursts through. The two are very linked. So then the ghost vanishes. And of course, Scrooge is back in his house. But acknowledging the suffering experienced as a child and the arising of some human sympathy for others who suffer as he has, the memory of all those warm feelings he's suppressed to protect himself, and the gratitude for his benefits he's received. All these have started, they've kicked off a big thawing, they've kicked off a big change in Scrooge. So when his next ghost appears, the ghost of Christmas present, Scrooge is open to what it has to say to him. He is receptive. He's now got that quality that allows him to really start growing. He's receptive. So he asks the ghost, if you have anything to teach me, let me profit by it. That's a big change. That's a big change in receptivity. And what the Ghost of Christmas Present mainly does is show Scrooge other people enjoying Christmas, or actually show Scrooge other people enjoying their close, warm relationships with others, which he lacks. It shows him the joy of relatedness, the joy of connectedness. It shows him especially people he thinks he is better than, because he is rich and they are poor. People thinks he is better than actually really happy, which has a happiness that has nothing to do with their wealth. So he shows him his poor nephew that he said bah humbug to, with his friends and his fiancée. And he shows him his poor, unprepossessing, downtrodden clerk, Bob Cratchit, with his family, who turns out to be not so poor at all because he's got a much richer life than Scrooge, because he's loved and he loves others. And hardest to take of all for Scrooge, he sees himself as he looks in other people's eyes. So he sees that other people, far from admiring him and thinking he's better than them because of his money, they actually feel sorry for him. They feel sorry for him for the way he's cut off from human relationships and from positive emotions like joy and metta. So this is a big dose of self-knowledge for Scrooge. Suddenly, the defended castle of self that he has built does not look so attractive after all. Instead of everyone thinking that he is better than them, he suddenly realized that that's not true. He is sick of himself. He becomes sick of this defended castle that he has built, this defended castle of self. So he is ready for the third aspect of the spiritual life, spiritual death. He's ready to leave that old Scrooge behind. The old Scrooge has to die so that a new Scrooge can be reborn. And he sees that willingly. And then finally, in the last watch of the night, the third spirit appears to Scrooge, the ghost of Christmas yet to be. And this is a pretty grim prospect for Scrooge. He sees his own death and the legacy he leaves behind him. He sees the important businessmen who he thinks are his peers, who, well, they don't like him at all. They think he's a cheapskate, a mean, miserable so-and-so. One of them says it'll be a very cheap funeral because no one will go. And another one says, well, maybe I'll go because there'll be a free lunch. He sees he has no friends in the world at all, and that all his treasures, all his possessions don't matter. He's dying alone, lonely, miserable. And Dickens says he thinks avarice, hard-dealing, griping cares, they have brought me to a rich end truly. He asks the spirit if there's anyone who feels any regret about his death, and he's shown a couple who owe him money and are near to being thrown out of their house, and he hears them say how glad they are he's died, because whoever the debt passes to won't possibly be as hard-hearted as Scrooge. So that's a pretty, I mean, it just adds to the idea that I do not wish this self that's created this situation to continue. And then he's shown the future after his death, someone else in his chair in his office, an overgrown gravestone that nobody cares for. But then, as the morning dawns, the ghost of Christmas yet to be morphs into his bedpost. He has experienced a spiritual death. And he had really thought he was dead. He really thought he had died because he had this vision of life after his death. So he's immensely relieved that he's still alive. And it seems to him he's had a reprieve. He's got this amazing opportunity. He still has a chance to change himself and the impact he has on the world. He's been offered a spiritual rebirth. And he says, I'm light as a feather. I'm happy as an angel. I'm merry as a schoolboy. I'm giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. Hello there. Whoop. Hello. I don't know what month it is. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Never mind. I'd rather be a baby. Hello, whoop. Hello there. So he's like a baby. He's been reborn like a baby. He's had a profound spiritual experience. And getting back to our scheme of the stages of the path, this has led him to a spiritual death, which has allowed a spiritual rebirth. So he's a new man. He sends a turkey to his poor clerk's house so they can have a great family Christmas. He sends it by taxi as well. Costs a fortune. He gives a large sum of money to a charity collector who comes by. He goes to his nephew's house for Christmas dinner and has a whale of a time. He's completely changed. He's reborn as a happy man. Dickens tells us he became a good friend, as good an employer and as good a man as London ever knew. Some people laughed to see the change of him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing good ever happened at which some people did not laugh. And anyway, they looked better laughing. And he, in his own heart, laughed, and that was good enough for him. So Scrooge has been well and truly reborn. He's moved from darkness to light by becoming more integrated, opening up to positive emotion, experiencing spiritual death and rebirth, and the whole process accompanied by an opening up of spiritual receptivity. And that's a process that we can all help along in ourselves by following the spiritual path and by noticing how we defend our version of ourselves from awareness and change, just like Scrooge did. Like Scrooge, our old ways of life that keep us fixed in our old personality, they're threatened at the moment. They're threatened by these dark times, by COVID, in ways we probably don't like at all. But as with Scrooge, being kicked out of our old patterns is an opportunity to leave behind an old version of ourselves and step into bigger shoes. And so that will bring us into light from these dark times for us as individuals. But this story of Scrooge may also have to say something to say to us as a society, how we can move out of dark times as a society. Like Scrooge, as a society, we've acted as though wealth, stuff, is what's most important and brings true happiness and well-being. There's nothing wrong with wealth, but past a certain point, we don't need more of it. And we've ignored some of the things that really do bring well-being. So we can imagine Scrooge's nephew asking us, you're rich enough, why are you so dismal? Because even before COVID, there was an epidemic of depression and anxiety in our society. So in some ways, I think our society was already in a dark place before COVID. And after COVID, it's going to be materially poorer. Scrooge will have lost some of his money pots. And if that's all that changes, things will have got even darker. To move from darkness to light, like Scrooge, to make this an opportunity to turn the situation into something positive, we need to turning around of our priorities towards things like community, connection, caring, solidarity, higher meaning. And I think that as Dharma practitioners, as a Sangha, we have a big role to play in making that happen. Thank you.